Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today is a very special day because I've got acclaimed board game designer and good friend Rob Van Zyl joining me, and he's going to be talking a little bit about his new game, which is currently on Kickstarter right now. I don't know if you can see that. It's called The Dead Eye, and you can see it's beautiful artwork and all of that. And we're going to talk all about the game, what went into putting it together, and what what it's all about. So, Rob, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to see you, Gareth. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Yeah, no, absolutely. A pleasure every time. So, Rob, let's just get started for people who don't know anything about the game and are curious and intrigued by that beautiful box art. Give us the 90-second elevator pitch for the Dead Eye.
The Dead Eye is a solo adventure card game. The basic premise of the game is that you have crashed on a strange and alien and hostile hazardous planet, and you are marooned and must escape before all your resources have run out. The sort of key hazard in the game is something called tox. The planet is obviously a very poisonous environment, so you've obviously got a very limited time to actually get off this planet. What makes the game quite unique is that it is purely a solo game. It's not a multiplayer that has a solo component attached to it. And also what's quite interesting is we've explored stereoscopic 3D in the game, both within the visual representation and in some of the gameplay aspects as well. So as far as a pure solo experience goes, I think it's quite unique.
Fantastic. Sure, you've brought up a lot of things that I really want to talk to you about and cover in a lot more detail. But the first thing that you mentioned is the game's got quite an interesting story. Would you classify it as a science fiction game? Am I hearing that correctly?
I think that would be correct. It's a homage to multiple science fiction genres. I think it would be regarded as a sci-fi post-apocalyptic Western, maybe in the genre of something like Gunslinger by Stephen King, or a Mad Max, very much sort of the Antipodean Western, very much sort of an Australian model, but sort of set in a strange science fiction post-apocalyptic world.
That sounds amazing. I mean, I am a huge sucker for anything post-apocalyptic and sci-fi, so mashing the two of them together just sounds like a complete marriage made in heaven to me, so I'm very, very excited. So you said it's a solo card game. Tell me a little bit about like sort of some of the mechanisms, how it actually plays. Are they dice? How does it work? How is the game driven? And what are the sort of choices that the players have to make when they're playing a game of The Dead Eye?
The Dead Eye is based on a design by Simon McGregor, who's a game designer I've worked with on the last couple of games that we've done. It comes from a game design that he's called Patience Zero. So similar to Patience, you have a single deck of cards. You play through that deck of cards, and every card that you draw, you can be used in one of two ways. Essentially, the game design comes down to trying to optimize your play deck. You'll play through your deck several times. Certain new cards will come into that deck. They're called Strength and Hope, and they will make the luck of your game or the bad luck of your game increase or decrease. At its core, each card can be used in one of two ways. It can either be used to try and win the card, which has various advantages if you win the card, or the card can be used for its good or bad resource, which are called juice and heat in the game. These stack up onto either side of the card, and when a trigger condition occurs on the card that you're playing against, a good or bad effect happens. That is essentially the core of the game.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'm a big fan of games where cards or any component has like have like multiple uses. So the idea of a card that can be used for multiple different things and has multiple different elements on it is really, really cool and exciting, and something that's interesting. Yeah, and what excites me about this is that you say it's basically just a deck of cards. So would I be correct in assuming that the game has got like quite a fairly sort of modest footprint and it's portable, something you can maybe play on a plane or a long train ride and that sort of thing?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's very much. We have brought a game board into the game, so it can be used with a game board, and that obviously makes it very easy to work out where your card placement is, and adds a slightly more immersive element to the game. but the game can be very much picked up and played as from a deck of cards and has a very small footprint. So absolutely, within a solo game experience, you want something that has a very small footprint, because often a solo game is played, as you say, when traveling. It's a quick pick up and play. You have 5 minutes or 10 minutes to quickly put a game in. And that was also quite important, that the gameplay length was quite short, that it wasn't sort of a sit down, it was a long hour experience. The whole game has probably an hour and a half in its totality to try and win the game, but it's been broken up into very nice bite-sized sort of 15, 20-minute runs, as we call them, that can be played as a standalone run and then saved and continued at a later stage.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So you don't necessarily have to sit down for this epic experience. You can do little chapters almost and then sort of progress through the game as and when you get a gap. Oh, that's really cool. And we've kind of now stumbled into the topic of the solo game. And just tell me a little bit about what inspired the idea behind a solo game and tackling that from a design and development perspective. What excited you about the idea of solo tabletop gaming?
I think obviously the first advantage of a solo game, certainly within a game design space, is your playtesting sort of development cycle is much easier to tackle, in that you can give playtest samples to single individuals. It can be tested quite quickly internally, rather than requiring large groups of playtesters. And then the actual experience of the game is a single. It's a single emotional experience where you're not relying on other players around the table. It's very much how you respond to the feeling of playing that game. So I think that's very strong. The idea to design a solo game, that really was driven by the game designer, Simon McGregor himself, in that he presented a game to me last time we finished our previous game, which was Conjure. We met in Essen, which is a game for every year. He said he had a very unique solo game that he'd been working on. I was initially quite reticent because I wasn't quite sure what the model was for a solo game. I hadn't much experience of solo games myself. I hadn't played many, and I wasn't even quite sure what the model would be. But obviously, once exploring it and getting into the development cycle with the game, it started really emerging. And then once we started exploring the stereoscopic aspect and going, okay, wait, we can do something that's 100% immersive solo experience that would only work as a solo game, then it became quite exciting. And then we started sort of bridging that gap which is similar to the video game space, where it becomes a solo adventure.
Brilliant. That's exciting. In my sort of experience of playing solo games, I find a lot of them end up just becoming a puzzle that once you've solved it and once you've figured it out, like some people would say certain cooperative games are that way, that there's like a puzzle to solve, and once you've figured it out, then it's fairly straightforward and easy. And I have this question, and also you opened up questions to some of your Kickstarter backers, and Ratley17 said it well, and they said, do you have any plans to include variable difficulty in the game? So how does the game's difficulty adjust to account for more experienced players?
I think what's quite interesting, and I think this is going to have to be experienced by the players, is that the game itself is an emergent puzzle. So the first time a player would play the game, they would be playing it quite blind. They would be unable to really understand what's in their deck that they're playing through. So they would find it incredibly hard. The game doesn't necessarily get easier as they play because of the nature of the hope and strength decks. The game is constantly varied. So they will certainly have runs which are harder and some which will be easier. The experience of the game will determine how well they play the game. But because of the nature of those decks, it can always be changed up. So I suppose that would probably answer that question. That the difficulty could certainly be ramped by including harder cards. For instance, the game, the core the core objective of the game is to unlock destination cards, win those destination cards, and one of those destination cards will allow you to reach safe haven. To obviously unlock those destination cards, you require distance, which is points in the game. There's only so many distance cards in your deck and in the strength and hope decks. So certainly difficulty can be ramped up by reducing that number of cards so that it becomes harder for you to potentially get the distance points you need.
Cool. That's excellent. Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of the sort of the randomness of the card game and the randomness of the shuffle will sort of eliminate some of the predictability that I think plagues a lot of other cooperative or solo games. Is that like people know where it's going and yeah. So I have a question for you. One of the things that people notice about your games and comment on all the time is that they're super strongly themed. And that's from, like you say, you've got a whole story, a whole backstory, the graphic design, everything. I mean, this is a deeply thematic product. How do the mechanisms interlock with the themes and how do those work together? Like how are the themes reflected in the mechanics?
I think what happens at the beginning of any of these design processes is working out what would be a potentially strong theme to fit with the mechanic. And then try and find a middle ground where those two can meet quite comfortably. It is certainly a tough challenge. I tend to immerse myself in trying to theme almost every mechanic so that everything has some sort of locking mechanism with the theme and the mechanic. So with this game, there was obviously a feeling of risk. There was a feeling of sort of an emergent puzzle that wasn't quite clear at the beginning of the game. There was a bit of press your luck. There was good luck, bad luck. And there was obviously a sense of pace. There was a sense of momentum, a sense of high risk, and there was definitely a feeling of blowing out, or the sort of the survival aspect. At some point, you simply ran out of luck. Your fate was almost inevitable. So taking all of those sort of aspects that were emergent from the mechanic was then the sort of starting point of going, okay, this could be a survival adventure game. I've always been keen to do a survival adventure game that's set in a sort of science fiction apocalyptic planet. So that sort of became the starting point for a lot of these sort of ideas.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's a great answer. And now tying back into the theme and the story, does this game have any connection to some of the other games in the Ancient Terrible Things universe, or is it purely an aesthetic connection? When I say Ancient Terrible Things universe, the Pleasant Company universe, so ATT, Conjure, Snowblind, that sort of thing.
The obvious connection is that it's the same design team. It's myself being the creative director and the writer and illustrator, and Simon McGregor being the game designer. So that's a clear thread through all of the games that Pleasant Company Games have done to date. From a thematic perspective, there is certainly roots in all of the games in that they're all quite. Let me try and get this phrasing correct. They're all based in places that are relatively uninhabited, generally quite inhospitable. And certainly in the case of Ancient Terrible Things and The Dead Eye, they're a forgotten world or an ancient world where one is quite unsure of exactly what has happened there or what sort of lies or lurks behind the facade of this ancient place. So there's certainly roots that tie those two together. Snowblind, for instance, is obviously set in the Antarctic, which is, of course, its own sort of hazardous and inhospitable place itself.
Yeah, I think that would be sort of something that I picked up as well, is like in your games, the environment is as much a character as the characters and, the players. The environment is such an integral part of all of them, I think. Really interesting stuff.
I think you've identified that in many ways the environment is the primary character, and the Dead Eye was one of those cases where we made the environment the central figure in the story.
Brilliant. That's amazing. So let's move on now and talk a little bit more about the art, but in particular the technique around this very unique presentation. And our question comes from Kickstarter backer Ryan Bird, and he has a few questions. I'm going to just sort of list them all together because they all relate to the same sort of topic. And it's just talking about the fact that this game uses, let me whip out my glasses over here, uses stereoscopic 3D to present the artwork in a way that pops out of the cards and out of the map and all of that. So tell me, how did you learn to do the 3D art, and what was the sort of process of putting together a game that used this sort of quite vintage but in a good way form of 3D?
I think stereoscopic is it's an interesting technique because, as you say, it's quite a vintage technique. And in fact, its roots are very much back, sort of old school comic books from the 1950s, early sort of Superman and Batman comic books, all started employing this technique. When I originally started the game, The Dead Eye, there was no intention to do stereoscopic 3D, but there was very much an intention to do a printer offset feel to the game that would give it sort of a retro kind of 80s sci-fi pulp feeling to it. So the intention to do an art direction that had this red-blue sort of offset was very much there from the beginning of the project as an art direction process. During that early development, I actually stumbled upon a graphic novel it was one of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen graphic novels, and it had a stereoscopic 3D part to the comic book. And I remember this sort of was in the back of my mind, and I remember digging this comic book up and obviously finding and going, well, it's got the perfect, it's got this chromatic aberration. Looking at and obviously once I popped the glasses on, it was a whole new world where I hadn't really experienced print 3D before. We've all experienced film 3D, and it's been quite popular the last couple of years, but to experience 3D in a print environment was very exciting. And what was very exciting about seeing the print 3D was the fact that you could start playing around with sort of multiple levels with regards to your information and with regards to your heads-up display sort of stuff. So you could have certain information at different levels, and that sort of started a whole wellspring of possible directions that this could go in. And what was obviously exciting was that it didn't compromise the original vision for the game, which was to have this kind of chromatic shift of being on this sort of alien planet with this sort of electrostatic and this kind of retro sci-fi feel to it. So moving forward, it was a feeling of using that technique in the most subtle way possible, that it would still be there, and you could certainly, play it with 3D, and we're marketing it as a 3D game, but wouldn't require the 3D and would feel like quite a satisfying experience without the stereoscopic nature.
Perfect. I think you've, the fact that you don't need the 3D, the cards still look cool and the art still looks cool without it. But if you feel like doing something different, it's really quite an exciting and super unique presentation. So the next thing I want to talk about is that there's a comic in the box. Now, I don't know if this comic that I have here, I'm not going to show anyone because it's like top secret, guys. This is the prototype edition. But tell me a little bit about the comic and the process that sort of went into writing and creating that.
That was very much inspired by, one of the roots of the game was, one of the inspirations from the game, digging back to my childhood, was an old solo card game called Chainsaw Warrior, that was done by Games Workshop back in the mid-'80s, which has actually had it's got a very similar roots to this game, where you're also playing a deck of cards. You're trying to survive as long as you can through this deck of cards. That was sort of an escape from New York in 60 minutes kind of idea. There was lots of zombies and 2080 type characters. But what was wonderful about that board game is it came with this introduction comic that kind of got you into the world, sort of set up the scene, brought you to sort of now you start the game. And I love that because I've always loved board games as a form of comic book narrative or sort of a form of interactive comic book. And I loved how they managed to do that, where it was a comic book that became a board game. So you started off as a comic book, and next thing you were sort of almost in the comic book. And what was quite nice with the Dead Eye is it's got a similar sort of feeling where it's got a comic book, and then once you're into the cards each feel like a panel in a comic book. And try to keep it as well that all the cards in the game are very much point of view, POV. It's sort of you in your rig trying to escape this planet, and all the art was from that perspective, which was quite challenging in that everything had to be considered from the perspective of the player trying to escape this planet.
Amazing. Yeah, wow. I hadn't actually thought about it that way, but you're right. All the cards are from that first-person point of view. That's super cool. And I like the idea of including these sort of non-essential feelies. I mean, back in the old days of video games, like big box video games, you would get maps and all kinds of other cool stuff. And it seems we see less and less of that these days. So it's nice to see things like comic books and maps and that sort of thing be included where we can. Tell me a little bit about some of the Kickstarter sort of exclusives and stretch goals that you have in mind, and then we have a few questions from some of your backers.
The stretch goals are very much, we keep them quite close to our chest, and we've left a lot of them open for discussion during the Kickstarter. The obvious ones is to have a couple of promo cards that can be suggested by the backers and get them to sort of suggest ideas. We've got certain ideas, and I've got certain ideas for what the Dead Eye is and what the planet is. But what we've found, and certainly in our previous Kickstarter campaigns, is it's really nice to get an idea from backers who might feel quite strongly about the genre, for instance, and they might have their own ideas. And in the past, some great ideas, some great writing has come from backers themselves. And I think it's quite nice to leave that space open to see what guys can come up with. Certainly from the game itself, it is quite a delicate line. It's because that game we feel is very internally complete. We've gone out of our way to make sure that every aspect of the game is a unique card. For instance, there's no duplicate cards in the game. So that's certainly within that model. We don't want to really mess with the game itself so much, but we're certainly looking for extras that we can add and polish and make the game slightly more interesting. For instance, it was a great idea to use the box itself within gameplay, and this obviously tied back into wanting to reduce your footprint even further, because during testing, it's very nice to have something that, as you say, is quite compact, but even when you pull out a game, you think, well, now what do I do with the box? The box has to get put somewhere, and that has a footprint, especially if you're in a public space or you're traveling, you now have to put that box away somewhere. We thought, oh, well, couldn't we actually play from inside the box and make sure that no aspect is not used? So this literally, you could pack out your cards, then flip the box over, and then the inlay tray would have your hope and strength decks, and we could use the cavity in the middle of the box as your discard pile and build around that. So that's one of the stretch goals that we've now added, and we're going to do color print for that inlay box, and you could sort of mount your cards on the inside of the box on that cardboard inlay with some sort of with a color print in it. So that's one of the things where it's still adding to the components that are there and just making them slightly more interesting. Some other things that are sort of floating around is I think there's a lot of call for stickers. I think a couple of the backers have brought that up. Is everyone loves stickers, and I think in a game that sort of reeks of sort of a punk rock kind of 80s aesthetic. I mean, I think stickers is just perfect for that. We're sort of in discussion in our development team to say how would those stickers manifest? How could they be used? Would they be things that you just sort of augment your box with? Would you put them on your laptop, or would they actually be things that you can actually stick onto the board to cover up various things? So all of these ideas are sort of floating around, and I'm sure we're going to get some more ideas from backers as we kind of get further into the process. The other thing which is also floating around, and I think this is going to probably come, once again, we're keeping it like a little bit close to our chest, but maybe we can give a little bit of a reveal, is that I think there's a bit of discussion around prescription eyeglass wearers and their concerns about wearing 3D specs, or the sort of paper 3D specs that come currently in the game. I am an eyeglasses wearer myself. So I can understand that, and it was a concern to go, well, how do we make sure that this can be tackled? The glasses that come in the current game will have multiple sort of bend points, and they'll be quite wide, so that obviously you can go all the way around a pair of standard glasses. But one of the stretch ideas was to also produce what we're calling hook behind glasses, where they'd almost be sort of small stereoscopic specs that could actually be hooked behind your glasses, and that would sort of work for multiple sizes of eyeglasses. So that's another one that's sort of in the boil and being stirred around in the pot. And then, depending on where the campaign goes, at this point, the campaign is we're trying to get the game made. But obviously, if the campaign reaches sort of quite large levels of post-funding, we can start looking at extended content and possibly an extra story 3-card story deck. But that'll already determine the size of the Kickstarter campaign.
Wow, wonderful. Thanks so much for that. You've answered a lot of your backers' questions, including Jim McKettrick Supplicants Moa's question. Lennon Fargon wants to know if the game will have linen finish cards.
This is an interesting question, and this hasn't been finalized yet. The 3D aspect of the game means that I'm quite wary to put anything between the quality of the printing. Obviously, it'll be very high quality printing, and a mesh. And where linen finish often has like a very fine mesh, we have a concern that might add an additional level of let's call it static between what's already quite a challenging visual environment. So this hasn't been decided yet. At this point, the answer was most likely to be no, but not to say that the cards wouldn't have a great finish. And we've obviously, one of our stretch goals was to upgrade the cards to the highest quality card stock that we could get. And I think this will go a long way to making sure that the cards have a very premium feel.
Yeah, I think so. So the answer there sounds to me like you're going to go for the best thing that you can get that'll enhance the 3D experience as much as possible. And I think that's definitely the right way to go. Another question from Delia and Jack, and I think you have kind of answered this, but any plans for expansions for the game? I know you mentioned a 3-card story deck.
I think that would be the right place to expand on the game. At this point, as mentioned, we want to make an internally complete game that is very much played out of the box. And I think a lot of games rely on expansion content to become a full game, or to be to create the full game experience. And I often am quite wary of that. I like that a game has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that you've got everything that you need in the box. Certainly the game has potential for expansions, and as mentioned, I think those could come within the story deck. I've had much discussion with the game designer on the core set of cards, which is your sort of the main game is 54 cards, but the core mechanical cards, which are, as I say, taking out the story deck, is about 44 cards. We've had lots of discussion, and that set of cards is largely complete. We've iterated, and we've got the best possible cards for this mechanic in that deck. So that for me is quite complete. But the story deck certainly has potential for expansions. And I think the game, what's quite nice is it can have these sort of very short 3-card runs. Small stories. They can iterate. And I think there's certainly potential for that.
That sounds great. And I think one of the appeals of the game is that it is so compact and there's no extra fat on there. So I think that, for what it sounds like to me, is that definitely seems like a nice way to expand on the story and the universe without adding any unnecessary bloat.
Absolutely.
My last question, or Samuel Delcurd's last question, is what is your company's stance on Black Lives Matter? And what are you doing to increase representation and or address racial inequality in the industry?
I think I think we as South Africans, we live in, it's quite top of mind. I think the sort of social justice, I mean, we as South Africans, certainly as white South Africans, in a very, probably the most unequal society in the world, are very aware of this issue. The social, the social justice and activism takes a slightly different model in this country, where it's a very different demographic. But certainly, from myself and my own personal experiences, we have made an effort with sort of outreach of doing sort of board games in underprivileged communities and introducing board games to underprivileged communities. From a company perspective, the company is only one individual at this point, so it's certainly not a company culture to be exclusionary, and I think that's kind of where we stand right now. I mean, there's certainly solidarity, and I think the industry, or certainly the field, could do with more diversity, and I think it should be encouraged. I think in any creative field, I think the different voices, different cultural voices, is certainly important. And I think it's also important not to have a situation where there is only one voice within creative works. I think it does make it myopic, and it can do with new voices. How those are brought in, certainly in our country, is quite challenging. Being South Africa, is that a lot of the problems are economic, in that I think the exclusionary nature of board games is not so much cultural as it is economic. And I think that's certainly the challenge that we have, is that that board games in the South African context are quite they're quite elitist, just from a monetary perspective.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And yeah, quite a sort of a strong message to end on there. Rob, I just want to thank you for joining me for this chat. It's been super enlightening, and I'm very excited about the Deadeye. I love all of your games, so this is no big surprise. And yeah, I wish you the best of luck with the rest of the campaign. And guys, if you're seeing this, it's on Kickstarter until when? What is the date of the campaign?
We're running it till the end of the 3rd of July. When I say the end, the end of the afternoon, I think that'll probably be 4 p.m. Eastern time, which is New York time. It'll probably be 10 p.m. South African time. So it'll be the day before the 4th of July, leading into an American weekend, a holiday weekend. So hopefully guys will come on board and be excited just before they go on holiday. We are looking to go straight into production thereafter. So we'll probably be finishing up the core card production the following 2 weeks, delivering the print and play to all the backers probably mid-July, so that everyone can sort of get their hands on it and see what the game is about. We've obviously encouraging people, even if they have got the print and play in their inbox, to not open it unless they can't resist. And this has really kind of come from the game designer himself, not just myself, but the game designer felt very strongly that it is an emergent puzzle, and it shouldn't be studied too much as the first time you play it. I think the best way to play the Deadeye is absolutely blind, is to open up that box, read the comic book, crack open the deck, and literally turn over the first card and play. The first time you play it, you will die, and you will die quite quickly, and that's how it should be. And then slowly you will start seeing the emergent puzzle coming out of it. So that's kind of I digress, but that is kind of our plan for the PMP, and then it'll go into production end of July, and we're aiming for delivery by November. Obviously, that's the world is in flux right now, as we all understand, and certainly shipping channels are in flux. But we have our manufacturers lined up, we have our fulfillment partners lined up. So all those guys are we have been on this carousel before. And the only thing that will really sort of change that potential delivery would be force majeure and things that are out of our control.
Yeah, guys, the game is, this is not just some pipe dream that some guys talking about. The work has been done. It's ready to go. So hop on that Kickstarter, back it. And Rob, best of luck. And maybe we'll chat again soon, maybe after the Kickstarter or towards the end. But best of luck. Cool. Thanks for watching. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.